Okay, so part 2 of our journey through getting the EPROM emulator built. In the first episode we soldered everything, so all the components on the main PCB, we soldered the Arduino. Today we're just going to try to get everything up and running, but before we do it, let's clean up a little bit the flux on all the components to make it nice and clean. I'll remove the Arduino from the socket first and remove the board from its plastic stand. That's a 3D printed stand that I offer with the kit, or you can download the STL files and print it yourself. So for my procedure, I use isopropyl alcohol, 99% isopropyl alcohol, to clean the flux. I pretty much soak the board in isopropyl alcohol. Obviously, watch out, because isopropyl alcohol is, it's not very healthy. So make sure that you are in a well ventilated area and that you don't expose yourself to these harmful fumes. I'm lucky enough to be based in sunny California, so I can do it outside. I use this anti-static brush to clean, obviously, the flux, and after scrubbing a bit, it should be good enough to go. I'll rinse it a bit more with a little bit more isopropyl alcohol, and I typically put another fresh dry tissue on top and sort of scrape the rest of the isopropyl residue, and that should be pretty much nice and clean, ready to go. So just to give you an idea, a little bit more. Let's make sure that it's all nice and clean and dry. At this point there's no components, really no active components on the board, so it's not really that crucial to observe all the anti-static recommendations. So that's fine. I think we're kind of done with the main board. So to give you an idea, that's what we ended up with in terms of the soldering. So I would say it's nicely soldered. It's acceptable in my standards. Okay, so that's the main board. And we'll do the same thing with the Arduino Nano. Obviously there's a plug here for the USB, so I normally hold it the way that all the residue and all the isopropyl kind of flows down, so it doesn't get into the socket, into the USB plug or into the USB socket. It's probably not good for the connections. We don't want to end up with some kind of unreliable connection, so that's why I sort of rinse it with a lot of isopropyl alcohol. But that should be enough. Let's see. Yeah, nice and clean. Excellent. Okay, so that's cleaning done. So what we'll do is we'll assemble the emulator board back into the plastic stand. We have a bit of flux here. We want it nice and clean, so just removing a little bit of flux that is still here. Okay. So that's done. I'll install the Arduino. And now we're going to populate the rest of the components on board. I'll take you back inside my lab. Okay, so we're ready to assemble the components on the board that we soldered. Let's start by installing all the ICs. Obviously, you will notice that most of the devices that come in the DIP package, the legs are spread a little bit from the ideal shape to go straight into the socket. So if I attempt to install this RAM chip right now into the socket, I don't know if you can see it, it doesn't really fit straight in. So you need to bend the legs to kind of get it fit. Apparently there's a tool that is supposed to help you to do it. I don't have the tool, so I just put it against the table and sort of bend it a bit against the table. So that's how I would bend the legs of the memory. And once I have the legs bent to the desired shape, I would just start by inserting the IC on one side and sort of squishing it a little bit so that it gets in, and it's in. That's what we want. Yeah. So that's the one of the memory chips in. Same thing with the other. So this is the two SRAMs. Next one we'll do the shift registers, so the 74595s. Same thing, they are a bit more fiddly to bend, and as you can see I bend this one a little bit too much. Okay, let's do the other side, and this will go into the right orientation into U4. So that's one, U5, that's two, and U9. Okay, then we have the 74HC00. Okay, he's gonna go to U2. Another one, which is the 74HC08. So bend the legs a bit, and he's gonna go to U2, which is here. So this is U1, 74HC00, U2, 74HC08, and U6, which is the 74HC595. That's the SPI EPROM. He goes to the socket in the corner here. Okay, and last we have the 541s, which are the buffers. That's one. Two. And three. Okay, we got those done, and lastly are those resistor networks. Just watch out the markings on the resistor network. You will see there's a small dot on the left hand side corner which indicates pin number 1, and on our board we have a small arrow to indicate pin number 1. So like I said, this is recent change in the design, in a way that I've now provided those or recommended those precision sockets, so you can swap those resistor networks if you want for different values, or eliminate them entirely if you don't need them in your target. Like I said earlier on, ZX Spectrum will outright not boot with the pull-ups on the output enable. So there are situations where you have to remove those resistor networks. But all the other targets that I have used so far, and all the targets that the users reported to me, have worked fine. So that's almost everything. The last thing we want to do, or the last thing we can do, is install the screws to hold the board into the stand. Those screws are kind of not really essentially needed, because we don't really stress the board enough to require the screws. If you print it out the way the STL files are provided, it will be kind of a tight fit of the board into the base plate. So in theory, you don't need those screws here to hold the board, but I provide them anyway for now, since I still have the screws. So let's just tighten it in. We have a nice black nut and the screw, so we can just tighten it. Okay, and that's it. That's our emulator ready to go. At this point of time, it should just plug into the computer. If you've never used CH340 USB to serial bridge on your computer, at least in Windows, it will, within a couple of minutes, Windows will install the drivers automatically. You don't need to do anything. In Linux, I had the same thing. I didn't need any drivers. So that's pretty much ready to go. Next thing I'll do is I'll show you how to get the cable created, how to build the cable for the emulator. Okay, the last part of our journey to build the EPROM emulator is, of course, getting the actual emulator cable, or the emulator probe, built. Let me just quickly show you what the challenge is and what we need to do. So that's the emulator probe. That's what plugs into your target. Let's get a target and show you. So that's the target. In my target, we've got pin number 1 here. So we always want to align, obviously, the target probe accordingly. So for that, we have a label on the probe with the pin out, and obviously the marking like normal chips would have. I'm trying to look up a chip to show you. Hey, we got a Commodore PROM. So, that's the marking, and that's the marking on the probe. So we need to have this on the probe as well, otherwise we're going to get confused sooner or later and do it the wrong way around. So that's one end. Of course, on the other end, we have the 34-pin plug that goes into the emulator. Let me grab one emulator to quickly show you. So I'm using sockets on the emulator with latches, so it kind of keeps it nice and secure. So you have the notch in the socket, and there's a notch in the plug. I mean, that is if you buy a correct plug with the notch, and they are obviously supposed to mate together. You might ask, why am I using a 34-pin plugs and 34-pin socket on the emulator if I only use 30 pins or 30 a ribbon cable with 30 pins? Well, it turns out that 34 pins plugs and sockets are much cheaper than the 20 or than the 30 pin sockets. 34 was very popular because of the floppies. Floppy cables are using 34 pin connectors, so this was simple reason for using this type as opposed to using a 30 pin. Sorry for the background sound of my son playing piano. So like you see, some of the pins of this 34 pin sockets are not going to be used. So we're only going to use 30 out of the 34 pins. We also have the reset hooks. Depending on what I have in stock, I ship the kits will ship the emulator with different types of different style of the hooks. But that's what I've managed to find so far. In terms of the different types. So the one thing that kind of I do as an extra is once I finish soldering and getting all these hooks plugged in, so all the hooks kind of assembled, I dab a little bit of glue in here. Those cables, the ribbon cables, are not really meant to be soldered. So if you don't secure this area somehow, sooner or later the connection will come off. So I sort of learned throughout the years with my personal emulator that having a bit of, that's why I put also a hitch ring here, and I dab a little bit of glue. I use like a 2-part epoxy glue to secure this. So that's what we need to get to. So this is going to be the target for today. Let me show you some of the stages of the work. So I start with a long piece of ribbon cable. Okay, this one is I think 37 or 38 cables in one ribbon. So it comes out of a spool. So what you need to do first is obviously remove some of those, so you're left with just 30. So 28 for the emulator probe and another 2 for the hook. So you want to go down to 30. That's 30. Most of the ribbon cables will come with one of the cables marked in a color, so it's red in here. So when you change this from whatever you have originally down to the 30 cables that you want, obviously make sure you remove it from the other side. So leave yourself the one marked, because it's later easier to figure out what is what and where things are, where the cable should go. So we start with this long ribbon cable with whatever number of wires we have, and the first operation is to go down to 30. So that's what I've done in this cable. We're down to 30, but we have one of them in red, but it's down to 30. What's the length of this? So this initial ribbon cable, the length I recommend is 13, so that's 13 inches, which is about 33 centimeters. Now you might be tempted to go a bit longer. Obviously, I wouldn't recommend, because extending address and data lines out of your target system into the emulator over a long length of this ribbon cable might not be a good thing. You might end up with some kind of noise on the lines and things not working the way you expect. So my recommendation, 33 centimeters, this first initial length of the cable, 33 centimeters, which is about 13 inches. So that's the first step. Next step is separating the two wires that are going to go to the reset hooks. So we should be left with 30 on one side and 28 on the other side. So that's the next step. And those two will be used for the hooks. Okay, in the next step, we're going to reduce the length of the main part of the ribbon down to what is needed for the actual emulator probe. So this piece that is left over, okay, this piece that is left over with the two wires for the hooks, what do I have here? I have about 9.5 inches, which is about 24 centimeters. So 24 centimeters length, which is about which is about a 9.5 inch. Okay, so this is where we're going to work with. So that's our ribbon cable and the two bits that stick out for the reset hooks. I'll put it to the side. The first operation that you will do is kind of strips a little bit of the insulation for the mini hooks and get them ready to be soldered. I would recommend adding a little bit of flux at the end of those, just for the soldering operation. So let's get this this soldered. I should get myself one of those helping hands, but in the absence of helping hands, I'm gonna use my solder holder to hold this for me. So we're just gonna pre-tin the connection. So that's one done. Let's do the other one. Okay, so that's done. So the next thing is kind of getting ready for soldering the hooks. I kind of ship different styles of the hooks depending what I get. It's not really super crucial what we use for the hooks, but I mean, I use this style this time. So the one thing that I recommend doing is getting a little bit of heat shrink. I mean, I include the heat shrink in the kit that I offer, that you can buy from me. But ultimately, you want to get a little bit of heat shrink first on your connections. So I'll stick the heat shrink all the way to the back on both of my connections. And of course, this comes as a set, yeah. So don't forget, you want to put this in first before you start soldering. So that's the front, that's the back. So the blue one, and push it all the way in. And the red one, push it all the way in. So we've got those two ready. And then we want to solder. But before we solder, we want something to hold our hook. My soldering solder dispenser doesn't do the job anymore for me. So let's bring tool number 2 that I'll need later on anyway, which is a small vise. I have a small vise available, and maybe let's get a piece of foam here like that. We're just gonna get this guy angled a bit, and we'll hold it like this. Okay, so that's the blue one. Tin it a bit, and get the blue one soldered. Okay, that's done. Let's get the red one. Okay, so like I mentioned before, this connection is not perfect, okay? So you need to somehow protect it, otherwise it will come off. And how I know? I know because I've been using those things for a while. And I know that sooner or later, I'm just cutting a little bit of the wire that was sticking out. If I just close this and get rid of it, even if I, by the way, you know, at some point we're gonna heat shrink this, it's still not gonna be enough. This connection here is very sensitive. I mean, this will come off sooner or later. But just simply by using it, it will come off. So we need to secure it with a bit of glue. But before we glue, let's heat shrink it first. So I have a hot air gun, but just for the sake of doing it quickly here, I'll just use a lighter. So that's one. On purpose, I don't shrink all the way to the end. I leave a little bit unshrunk, otherwise it's, I mean, this will work better for what we're trying to achieve here. Okay. We can close those. So this is ready to go. This is ready to go. Like I said, the last thing we're going to do is we're going to dab a little bit of glue in those areas here. So we're just going to stick a little bit of epoxy glue. I kind of just dab a little bit of epoxy glue here and make sure that it flows a little bit inside. Where's my original one? I'll show you. See, so you end up with a little bit of epoxy glue here and here, and that holds, that secures, you know, the connection inside. You end up with a really nicely secured connection. Now, the operation is the actual emulator probe. So that's how it looks like when you buy a new one. Be careful, you know, watch out you don't close it accidentally, because yeah, it's a bit fiddly to remove. So whilst I handle it initially, I put a little bit of, you know, I put a half-cut credit card to secure it. You want to put some kind of label. Obviously, I include the label in my kit. And by the way, you can download this design of the label from the GitHub repository. It's printed on a Brother P-Touch printer with a 12mm tape. So you really want to start by somehow labeling this, because otherwise you don't know which way you're handling it. You know, you want to give yourself a reference point. So I would start by labeling it. So once it's labeled, what you will need is obviously at some point what we're going to do is we're going to clamp it so that the ribbon cable gets secured with this emulator probe. I bet, I mean, I'm pretty sure there is a professional or some kind of tool that is supposed to be used to clamp it. I don't have that sophisticated tool, so I just use a breadboard, a small breadboard like this. I start by plugging this probe into the breadboard itself. Let's flip it this way. So you see I've got the pin number 1 and pin 28 on my side, so on this side. I'll remove my card. Then you take your ribbon cable. Where your hooks for the reset lines, so where you got those two additional cables, where they stick out, this is where pin 1 and pin 28 is. So this part, you want to slide it into the probe the way that it matches where pin 1 and pin 28 is. So you sort of want to put it in. It's okay if a little bit of the cable sticks out, we'll trim it later. What is not okay, or what you have to be careful about, is that the cable is parallel to the probe. If you try to crimp it on an angle, it will end up crossing, or it will end up not working correctly. So be really careful how you insert. You know, make sure that the ribbon kind of falls into the ridges inside the plastic. It needs to really sit nicely in. You can kind of hold it by hand and start securing it a little bit stronger. So with this sort of sandwich, it's ready to be clamped. Now you need something to clamp it. You will see I'm using this small vise. That I found it to be the best thing to do, unless you have some kind of professional tool to do it. One thing to be wary of, or one thing to be careful of, is those cheap vise that you may come across, like this one that I have. I just bought it on Amazon. It's the cheapest of the cheapest vise that you can get. Those jaws, once they start clamping, they'll move a little bit, especially this one, obviously, because that's the one that moves. It will try to lift up. So when you put this probe into the vise, don't put it this way. Try to put it the way that the probe itself is resting against the jaw that is not moving. So let me make some more space. I'll initially secure it a little bit to give you a view. Okay, I'll push it in so it's nicely against the other wall, and now I can push it in. You will hear a click where the whole thing clicks in place. So that's now secure in on one side and on the other side. So that's what we wanted to achieve. So that's working. Obviously we need to somehow now remove it from the breadboard. I'll just use a exacto knife and remove it. Let's put the vise to the side for a moment. So now we have it clamped in, and the ribbon cable is clamped in. Obviously we have a piece of the ribbon cable sticking out. I use the exacto knife to trim it. Make sure that the exacto knife is fairly sharp, because you really want a nice and sharp and clean cut. Obviously be careful if you're handling sharp knives or any kind of sharps. You do it on your own, so be careful how you do it. Don't cut yourself and blame me for doing that. I'm looking for a sharper exacto knife. Actually, I don't have my sharpest exacto knife, so let's do it somewhere at the end of the exacto knife. So I just gently run the exacto knife against and just cut like this. As you can see, it's nice and clean cut. Okay, so we have one side of the cable done. If I place, so remember, I place the cable this way, so it's facing, whatever we crimped is facing down. Pin number 1 and pin number 28 is on this side, and the reset hooks are sticking out with the two pieces of wire, of which one is the red one. Okay, so now we focus on the other end. So on the other end we have the DIP28 or the IDC28 plug that has to be crimped in. So it's a similar process in terms of the crimping. Notice the way I do it, this IDC plug is sticking up. So this is sticking down, this is sticking up. I've marked with a bit of green here so that you can see this is where pin 1 is on the IDC cable. Pin 1 on the normal pin out of this of this connector. It's not the pin 1 from the DIP socket, sorry, from the ID, from the DIP28 probe. It's just the numbering on the actual connector. So number 1 is here. But remember, the first 4 are not even in use. So those first 4 pins are going to be not in use. Then the following 2 are the reset, and the rest of them is for the actual probe. So again, we now have 30 cables out of the on the ribbon cable, 30 cables in here. We want to make sure that we use all the pins towards the upper part of this connector. So you should have 4 spare pins at the bottom. I mean, if it's all sitting the same way as I do it. Yeah. So 30 ribbon cables all the way from the top to the bottom, and there should be 4 spaces empty. So 4 spaces not used. Let me see if I can show you that this way. Yeah. So that's how you want it. Again, same as with the other part of this connection, you really want to make sure that it's straight. You don't want to crimp it at the angle. You know, if you crimp it at the angle, you know, at some kind of angle, not really straight, it will crimp, but there's a chance that you have something misconnected or not connected correctly. Okay, so we bring our vise back to this whole thing, and we need to crimp. Once again, we're going to crimp this in. So I'm just first of all initially securing it a little bit, realigning it sort of in the middle, and now I can actually push it in. So that's now crimped. Okay. I would think that this should be good. This should be a successful crimp. Okay, like before, you want to trim the cable. So you have that area where you have 4 unconnected wires. So you really want to cut it down. If you cut it the other way around, you might end up with something not really perfectly fine here. So if you're cutting it, cut it this way, where you have the 4 pins empty at the top. So, okay, and that's a perfectly flat, nicely cut, nicely trimmed cable. And that's pretty much job done for your probe. Okay, you're going to spend another couple of minutes getting the you know, dabbing a little bit of glue and securing those reset lines. If you don't have epoxy glue, as a minimum, you want to put a little bit maybe hot melt glue, something to secure it, and that should be your emulator cable ready to go. Okay. So this kind of concludes the assembly of the emulator kit. At this point of time, you should have the emulator itself and the cable ready to go, and it's just a case of hooking it to the computer and using the provided Python script. Okay, I hope you enjoyed the video. Obviously, leave some comments if any of this stuff is not clear. Subscribe and like if you like the content, and I will see you on the next one. Thanks.